I'm Lidar Gravé-Lazi.
And I'm Alex Traiman.
And welcome to Jerusalem Minute. And welcome to Jerusalem Minute, where we'll cover the top stories out of Israel. And coming up this week, the hostage deal has taken effect and the pause in fighting is holding for now. We'll sit down with Israeli government spokesman Alon Levy to hear more about the hostage deal and international coverage of the war. The IDF is preparing for the day after the ceasefire, and a hot take on the Jerusalem Minute. And not only Gaza, Israel is facing threats from the north and the south and even out at sea. And the news you don't get to hear about, what's happening inside Israel. And now, our first topic. As of this moment, the pause in fighting between Israel and Hamas is holding as 26 Israeli hostages have so far been freed, mostly children and elderly women who were brutally kidnapped from their homes on October 7th. And more are expected to be released today. In exchange, Israel has released Palestinian security prisoners, mainly women and youth involved in acts of terrorism, and has provided humanitarian aid, including fuel, to Gaza. There is talk that a ceasefire may be extended if Hamas were to release additional hostages. And so, Alex, turning to you, 13 hostages were released last night, but only after a delay. Hamas seems to be playing sort of psychological warfare games. Was this to be expected? I mean, we are talking about a terrorist organization after all.
Exactly. The terrorists were supposed to be released at 4 p.m. on Saturday. We didn't see the hostages come across the border until after midnight here in Israel. And I think that a lot of people here did expect that the transfer of the hostages would not go smoothly. Hamas is a terrorist organization. We have seen psychological warfare being used from the very beginning. And the whole purpose of taking hostages is to commit an act of psychological warfare and to hold the Israeli public hostage to their demands. We saw that last night where Hamas wants to prove that they are the ones that are calling the shots and not the IDF.
We've seen the implementation of the deal. The pause in fighting is holding, despite all sort of the games that Hamas is playing. It's, of course, a welcome deal to see the hostages coming home, reuniting with their families. I mean, it's incredibly heartwarming. And I think all of Israel, wants to see the hostages returned. But the question is this a good deal? Is Israel getting a good deal here? Or does Israel maybe not have a choice in this matter?
Well, there's a lot of people inside Israel that are arguing that this is not a good deal. Yes, it's great to get the hostages back. We've received 26 hostages so far, expecting to get up to 50 in the next 2 days and the potential to get even more than that in the coming days if Hamas can deliver the goods, so to speak. But there are big questions about whether Israel should have paid the price that it paid in order to get the hostages back. First, we know that there's a pause of 4 days in the fighting. You had the IDF with significant momentum driving through the Gaza Strip. They had Hamas up against the wall. Hamas desperately needed the time off from the fighting to regroup and to rearm. So the first question is the IDF putting its own soldiers at greater risk because of the pause in the fighting? The second question is, of course, the trade. It's not hostages in return just for a pause. Israel is releasing a ratio of 3-to-1 prisoners that are sitting in Israeli jails for their participation in acts of terror, many of them committing acts of attempted murder, having blood on their hands, committing stabbing attacks, being suicide bombers. They're sitting in Israeli prisons. They're being released back, not to the Gaza Strip, but back to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and Eastern Jerusalem, the areas in which they came. So the question is, if you release terrorists back into society, are they going to commit additional acts of terror and again put more Israeli lives at risk?
And we've seen that they're Hamas supporters. I mean, they're coming out draped in Hamas's flags. What kind of unrest are they going to be causing now in the West Bank and East Jerusalem?
Exactly.
question.
This is the big threat. And then the other part of the threat is, well, now you've paused the fighting for 4 days, and the international community has been driving towards a ceasefire. So the question is, will the fighting actually pick up after the 4-day break, like the IDF and the Israeli government has said it's going to do? There is going to be tremendous pressure on Israel to continue the ceasefire for as long as possible.
And we have to see that Hamas is also really playing into this. You know, we saw yesterday a really disgusting video that Hamas itself put out showing its fighters, warmly saying goodbye to the hostages waving at Hamas and smiling. It's clearly propaganda. I mean, it's clear to everyone here in Israel, this is Hamas propaganda. Does the world see it that way?
Well, I think actually the best thing that could potentially happen for Israel, and this is a very twisted way of looking at it almost, is that if Hamas delivers the hostages on schedule, on time, as it says it's going to do, the world sees, well, wait a second, Hamas is a legitimate player. Yes, they took the hostages on October 7th. They had their reasons for doing that. But look, now they're releasing the women and the children, and they are an entity that you can negotiate with. If Hamas continues to pull some of the tricks that we saw last night, delaying the implementation, there was a belief late last night that Hamas may not release the hostages at all. Even today, we do not know if the hostages that are scheduled to be released will be released. We don't know if Hamas has more than 50 hostages alive. There's a lot we don't know. If Hamas somehow demonstrates once again that it is playing the psychological games, that it isn't a partner that can be negotiated with, that could actually increase the international pressure against Hamas and could increase the international support for Israel in their military aims of removing Hamas from power.
Now, I want to take a step back for a minute and remember the Gilad Shalit deal, where, this was a deal years in the making to release IDF soldier Gilad Shalit, and we released, I believe, Gilad Shalit, a lone soldier, for over 1,000 Palestinian terrorists, one of them being Sinwar, who's now the head of Hamas and is responsible for the October 7th massacre. We're releasing so far 150 Palestinian, terrorists, security prisoners. Is there a fear that the next Sinwar is out there somewhere?
Oh, absolutely. You talk about releasing 1,000 prisoners in exchange for one hostage. And this is the rule of what you don't do in a hostage situation, because actually releasing the 1,000 prisoners told Hamas that if you take hostages, you will get a significant return for that. And that mistake is what led Hamas to believe that it should kidnap as many people as possible on October 7th. Now, of course, Israel is not releasing 1,000 prisoners for one hostage. They're releasing 3 prisoners for a hostage. So certainly the ratio is not as bad, and there are many, many more hostages. So Israel wants to do what it can take in order to bring hostages back home, which they need for social cohesion and other things. But simply because the ratio of 1,000 to 1 was so egregious that 3 to 1 is now all of a sudden a good deal is not true. So releasing these terrorists could very well come back to hurt Israel. And there is a principle that you cannot cause blood for bringing lives home in return. So that's the calculation. Certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu and the War Cabinet were under a very, very difficult decision process that they had to make. What's the right thing to do? We have a lot of pressure from the families to bring the hostages back home. The civilians here in Israel certainly want to see the hostages come back home. At the same time, what is the most important of the military objectives? Is it to dismantle and destroy Hamas as an entity, or is it to bring the hostages home? Because sometimes each one of those goals works against the other.
Mm-hmm. So, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that Israel does have a moral obligation to return the civilians home. But on the other hand, we see that the government didn't entirely approve the deal unanimously. I mean, there were those who were opposed to the deal. What's your take on that? And why are so many Israelis still upset about this deal?
Well, we talked about the threats that it brings to the Israeli Population Center, also to the IDF. and there was not unanimous support inside Benjamin Netanyahu's largely right-wing coalition. Those parties to the right of Netanyahu wanted to refuse the deal. And when you talk about whether they had to what they had to accept, you have to accept the idea of releasing Palestinians from Israeli jails, and these are Palestinians with blood on their hands. So I think the question also is what made some of those members that were opposed to the trade, what made them come back and actually support the deal in those late night deliberations. And one of the reasons is because the IDF actually presented to the government that having the 4-day pause in fighting would be able to strengthen the IDF's positions, because they want to take some of their tired fighters out, bring new fighters in, and change some of the positions and do a redeployment inside the Gaza Strip. And that kind of is what led many of the former opponents of the deal to the last minute to approve it.
Mm-hmm. And many Israelis are, of course, upset that, this is a deal that doesn't include all of the hostages. Only 50. There are still 239, 240 hostages still being held in captivity with Hamas, minus, of course, the 26 that have been released. So what about the rest of the hostages?
Exactly. That's the other question. Once you've set a price of 3 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for women and children, will the price go up for additional hostages? Is the likelihood of bringing the additional hostages home more likely or less likely because of the deal? These are some of the questions.
And of course, Hamas has agreed to release women and small children. We know there were around 40 children under the age of 18 that Hamas was holding. Hamas also said that it would not separate between their children and their mothers. And we saw that they did just that, in fact, yesterday. And they separated entire families. Mothers and children were released, but the fathers are still being held. Or in some cases, even a child was released while her mother is still being held in captivity. More mind games?
Absolutely. I mean, late last night, Hamas was challenging Israel, saying that Israel was not leading, was not living up to its end of the bargain, which included an additional entrance of trucks of aid into the Gaza Strip. We didn't even talk about that. 200 trucks coming in per day, many of them with fuel that can be used for terror activities. But as Hamas accuses Israel of not living up to its end of the bargain, we saw already that it is changing the terms of the deal. And this is just its power games that it's trying to play to say, look, Israel, we have you by the collar, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. And, speaking of the humanitarian aid, this was one of the stipulations of the deal, that Israel would send in aid to Gaza, including fuel. Now, Israel has been very adamant about not sending fuel in because this clearly helps Hamas. Now they're sending fuel in. What can you tell us about that?
Well, we remember early in the war, the international community pushing Israel for humanitarian aid, saying fuel is very important for the hospitals, for the sewage, for other functions inside the Strip. And in the very beginning of the war, Netanyahu, Israel saying there will be no fuel going into the Strip until all of our hostages are released. And now we're seeing shifting talking points where some of the hostages are being released. But even before that, Netanyahu stating that fuel would be able to enter into the Strip, specifically for hospitals, specifically for sewage systems and for water systems to be able to operate, which they now say would lessen the scope of a humanitarian crisis inside Gaza. So Israel's playing along and giving the fuel, but there's a question again as to will this make life more dangerous for IDF soldiers if and when the fighting resumes?
Mm-hmm. And the IDF and the government has been absolutely adamant that the fighting will resume, and that will take us into our next topic. And joining us now with more on the hostages deal and the international coverage of the war is an Israeli government spokesman, Alon Levy. Eylon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So our first question is, we're hearing, about the hostages deal, that the hostages may not be released today. I mean, what can you tell us about that?
That we have reached an agreement to secure the release of 50 hostages, women and children, in exchange for a 4-day hostage release pause. It's not surprising that Hamas continues to psychologically terrorize the people of Israel. That has been part of its strategy from day one. Every minute that it keeps our hostages in the dark and keeps their families in the dark is an ongoing war crime, an ongoing crime against humanity. And we're demanding the full implementation of that agreement as we continue to uphold our side. And we're going to continue putting military pressure on Hamas to get everyone out. None of us are free till all of them are free, and there will be no one left behind.
Is this something that you've expected? That Hamas would not live up to the terms of the agreement in a straightforward fashion?
I don't think anyone expected the Hamas terrorists who burned, beheaded, and abducted people on October 7th to be men of their word. This isn't an agreement that has been reached indirectly through mediation with the Americans, the Qataris, and the Egyptians, with an organization that is trustworthy. We know we are dealing with a genocidal terror group that on October 7th committed an act of systematic extermination and would continue to do that against every man, woman, child in the country if given half an opportunity. So Hamas isn't suddenly turning around and giving us back hostages because it's decided to be nice or humanitarian or because it's realized it is evil to hold a 10-month-old baby hostage. It's responding to military pressure, and we've got to continue that pressure till we get everyone back.
And Eylon, pivoting away from the hostages deal into the international coverage of the war, you've been on international media since pretty much the outset of this war. And I want to show you a quick clip, and I want to hear your reaction to it. So let's just take a look at the clip.
I was speaking to a hostage negotiator this morning. He made the comparison between the 50 hostages that Hamas has promised to release, as opposed to the 150 prisoners that are Palestinians that Israel has said that it will release. And he made the comparison between the numbers and the fact that does Israel not think that Palestinian lives are valued as highly as Israeli lives?
That is an astonishing accusation. If we could release one prisoner for every one hostage, we would obviously do that. We're operating in horrific circumstances. We're not choosing to release these prisoners who have blood on their hands. We are talking about people who have been convicted of stabbing and shooting attacks. Notice the question of proportionality doesn't interest Palestinian supporters when they are able to get more of their prisoners out. But really, it is outrageous to suggest that the fact that we are willing to release prisoners who are convicted of terrorism offenses, more of them than we are getting our own innocent children back, somehow suggests that we don't care about Palestinian lives. Really, that's a disgusting accusation.
So I have to ask, what went through your mind when she asked you this question?
Disbelief stage by stage. I think I understood by the middle of the question where she was going and was bracing myself to see whether she would actually go there. One of the more bizarre questions I have heard in any interview. She doubled down afterwards and said her job as a journalist is to confront interviewees with difficult questions and controversial opinions, and I would completely agree. But I also think sometimes the media need to filter out some of the nonsense and more outrageous allegations and not take things in such a silly direction. I think you have a wonderful example here of the sort of cognitive dissonance where when the facts don't fit the overarching narrative that people have, they stick to that narrative instead of changing their mind about the narrative, in order to adapt the facts. Really an extraordinary case. In hindsight, I should have said, of course, not only would we be happy to do a one-for-one swap, we'd be quite happy to get all 240 hostages back in exchange for 0 prisoners, 0 violent criminals, especially if the original offer of 3-for-1 made the Palestinians feel undervalued. That's the last thing that we would want. But yes, indeed, a very strange question. And I'm glad, actually, that it has resonated so far, because I think it really was just the most grotesque illustration of some of the very twisted thinking that we find sometimes in the media. And it really hit a nerve. It really hit a nerve with people.
Yeah, that question became a meme of sorts on social media. And, you've had a different approach than many Israeli spokespersons over the years. You're much more direct. You're much more combative when you're receiving combative questions. And you've even taken to social media and you've used Twitter and put all kind of sarcasm and satire on your Twitter feed and developed a lot of followers and since this war has started. Tell me about if that was strategic. Is that a new approach that Israel's taking? Is that just you doing your thing? How are you dealing with this war?
I think Jewish history teaches us we always have a choice. We either cry or we laugh. And I think whenever there is an opportunity to shine a light on the absurdity of a tragic situation, we should do that. Personally, I've always been very drawn towards sarcastic humor, towards satire. I think it's a very effective way of getting a message across. And I think it's a very important way to make certain points really resonate. You can't just state the facts. Sometimes you have to shine a light on how absurd something is to make people wake up and realize that actually a lot of the stuff that they're hearing, a lot of the stuff that is being parroted is not normal. It's completely left of field. And using humor is a very effective way to do that.
And you've been on international media outlets around the world. I want to ask, how fair do you think the international coverage of this war has been?
It really depends on the media outlet. I think a lot of the American media has been extremely fair, from the left-wing outlets, MSNBC, CNN, through to Fox News, News Nation, Newsmax, very fair. Even the tough questions are always understanding. A lot of the British media has been quite hostile sometimes, and the Irish media is something else altogether, because sometimes they just approach it through a very specific lens. And that lens informs their coverage and their basic assumptions. I've had interviews where I'm told, Hamas has been begging to give back your hostages for 5 weeks now. Why is Israel only just responding to pressure to get their hostages back, right? And you have to say, no, let's take a step back. Hamas didn't want to give the hostages back. It's responding to pressure, to unrelenting military pressure. That military pressure is going to continue when Hamas stops giving us back our hostages. It's not like Israel had to be pressured into receiving children back. And so it can be very challenging when you're not only supplying information and facts that fit a narrative that already exists, you're having to try to just shift the way that people think completely about the situation. And often that's because they're interpreting the situation through the lens of their own conflicts. In Ireland, for example, they view our conflict through the lens of their own conflict. They see themselves as being the indigenous people whose lands were expropriated by settlers, and they look at Israel and they apply their own experience with Northern Ireland and Britain, their own narrative about that, onto the Israeli case. So it's very difficult because they're also very emotionally invested in that narrative as well. It's an intellectual and an emotional thing.
Well, certainly modern warfare is also taking place in real time on the media, in addition to on the battlefield. Can you tell me what it's been like to get information in real time, either from the government, from the IDF, how you've managed to work, and what's it been like working with politicians that have come together to unite from different sides of the political spectrum in real time during this war?
I'm working here as part of the National Public Diplomacy Directorate. Just in the room next to me here, we have all the big authorities sitting around the table, the army, the foreign ministry, the police, everyone, all making sure they're on the same page. As I say, it's important to make sure, the left hand knows what the right hand is doing. And therefore, we're able to get the data that we need in real time. And if there's something we have to check, then there's someone who's only one phone call away from the source of the information. But of course, we're playing a different game from Hamas, because Hamas knows that it can throw out any old lie, any old propaganda. The world will parrot it. And when it's proven that Hamas is wrong, no one learns their lessons. Just like the situation with the Al-Ahli hospital. They put out a press release saying that an Israeli rocket strike on a hospital killed 800 people. The sun came up in the morning. It wasn't a rocket. It was an Islamic Jihad shrapnel. The hospital was still standing and nowhere near 800 people were killed. And despite that, the media continued to parrot Hamas's claims, sometimes attributing it to Hamas, sometimes not. I saw a push yesterday from The Guardian. Hamas to suspend ceasefire deal until Israel lets aid into northern Gaza. A complete lie, because aid was getting into northern Gaza. That was a Hamas lie they didn't even attribute. And Israel has to be so much more careful, because we're a democratic state with a professional army and a professional civil service, and everything has to be checked. And that accuracy is sometimes at the expense of speed, as we saw with the Al-Ahli hospital incident. Israel could have put out a knee-jerk reaction immediately and denied it was us, because obviously we don't launch airstrikes on hospitals. But they wanted to check the information, they wanted to check the trajectory to make sure everything was right. And it took a few hours until we got the answer out. And I think everyone understands now the truth of that situation. And it took time to get the truth out. And in that time, the lie was able to get halfway around the world.
Well, Alon Levy, all we can say is to keep up the incredible work that you are doing as the Israeli government spokesperson. And thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you. That's very kind. Anytime. Keep safe. Thank you.
And today marks the 51st day of the Gaza war, as Israel is standing down and abiding by the pause in fighting as part of the hostage deal. But Israel has made clear that this pause will not deter it from continuing with its mission of eliminating Hamas. And so, Alex, how do you think the pause, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, how do you think the pause really will affect the mission? It gives time for Hamas to regroup, to re-strengthen its position. At the same time, you said it also helps Israel. So is this pause really a good thing for Israel?
Well, I think in a vacuum, the pause in and of itself is not a good thing for Israel. But when you get to bring back the hostages, that changes the calculation. I do believe that the IDF understands that it is by far the stronger force here when you're talking about the military battlefront between the IDF and Hamas. Hamas has automatic weapons, they have RPGs, they have explosive devices. They don't have nearly as many troops. Over 100,000 troops are inside the Gaza Strip in these days. They don't have the backing of one of the world's strongest and battle-ready air forces. So certainly the IDF has inflicted its will inside the Gaza Strip and can continue to inflict its will inside the Gaza Strip, and understands that even with a pause in the fighting, even if it does enable Hamas to strengthen its position, to regroup, to rearm, that the IDF can still win the war. But the question is, how many soldiers does the IDF risk losing, right? This isn't like a conflict like you see between Russia and Ukraine. In Israel, most of the soldiers, these are civilians. You have conscripts, of course, but you also have reservists. Every single person in the war to Israel, this is a father, a brother, a daughter, a sister, a son, a best friend, and Israel doesn't want to lose any soldiers. Right now, some 60 soldiers have been killed in battle, and for Israel, it's 60 too many. So if they risk losing additional soldiers, even though they could still win the war, this is a price that the Israeli public really doesn't want to bear, and that's the question. Yes, you're getting back 13, 26, 50 hostages, but if you would lose 50 soldiers as a result, is that a fair trade?
It's an interesting analysis. And, there's another element, I would say, is the international pressure on Israel. And we talked about this, so far Israel has enjoyed a tremendous international backing from the United States, from other countries. Do you envision this continuing, or is there now mounting pressure on Israel to maybe continue with a ceasefire, maybe even reach a more permanent ceasefire?
Well, certainly international pressure is one of the factors that led to the present ceasefire and the return of the hostages. I don't think it's the only or the primary source of pressure on Israel. There's a lot of domestic pressure as well. But certainly Netanyahu and Israel have stated that bringing back the hostages are one of the primary aims of the war. So if that's one of the primary aims of the war, there's a price that needs to be paid for bringing back hostages. If Israel would have turned around and said, you know what, keep the 50 hostages, we're going to go and continue this war until it's over and maybe not get the 50 hostages back at all, the international community could have turned around to Israel and said, you told us how important the hostages are, but you weren't willing to make the steps or pay the price that it was willing to pay. But we've seen throughout the entire crisis since it started, yes, the international community supports Israel's aim to dismantle, disarm Hamas, but they've said, as Anthony Blinken has said many times, the way Israel conducts the war matters. They've been putting tremendous pressure on Israel to reduce the civilian casualties inside the Gaza Strip, and that includes creating humanitarian corridors where Gazan residents can move from north to south, creating temporary pauses in the fighting in the previous days that would allow for Gazans to move through those humanitarian corridors, and also the concept of bringing humanitarian aid into Gaza. All things that in a war situation, you wouldn't expect the one fighting to be guaranteeing the provision of those types of humanitarian offerings to the other side. This is a war. But international pressure on Israel is great, and Israel very much values the international support that it gets. And so, again, these are considerations that the War Cabinet deliberates when deciding how to move forward.
And, this is interesting because, you talked about how Israel conducts this war. So let's talk a little bit about that and Israel's war strategy. Israel did initially tell Gazan civilians to move south. And now Israel has gone in, has surrounded, and said it's completed its mission in the north. And now it is set to move south. So First of all, a lot of questions coming up here. What challenges will the IDF now face in moving south, and what will it do with all the civilians that it had initially told to move south? Where are they going to go? And many more questions to follow. So let's hear your take on those.
Well, certainly the fighting's not finished in the north. We've seen that even to the very hours before the ceasefire in the Jabalia refugee camp and other places. There's still a job to be done. The IDF has not captured the entire north. They're still working in the tunnels under the Shifa hospital and other places. We saw in the first hours of this pause, of this temporary ceasefire, that Hamas told the residents that were now in the south that they should move back to the north. And the IDF had stipulated in the terms of the agreement that the population is not supposed to move back to the north. If perhaps that's because the fighting in the north is not finished. And in fact, the IDF employed riot gear and was shooting up in the air and using tear gas and other things to keep the population down to the south. So now you raise an important question, because we are getting to this, let's say, midway point in the war. We've taken care of the north, Gaza City, which is one of Hamas's strongholds. But soon, the fighting is going to shift to the south. There's significant fighting will take place in the city of Khan Yunis and in other places in the south. And the question is, what is going to happen to the Gaza residents? Right now, you have over 1 million residents of the Gaza Strip on the south. And the IDF says they can't move to the north. The international community, Egypt, says they cannot move to the south of the Rafah border and empty into Egypt. Jordan is saying we don't want any of the Palestinians to come into our territory, even though Jordan has a 60% majority of Palestinians within its territory.
Nobody wants the Palestinians. Nobody's willing to take them. Not Egypt, not Jordan, not any of the other Arab countries, and not the international community. I think that this is the perfect topic to address our next section, My Jerusalem Minute. So why don't you give us your take on the situation of Gazans in the south?
Thanks, Lidar. Of course, there are 1 million plus Gazan residents down at the very south of the Strip, basically sitting not far from the Rafah border crossing, which is Gaza's border with Egypt. And the question is, well, what's going to happen to them? The IDF has stated that they cannot move back to the north. In fact, they've employed riot gear since the beginning of this temporary ceasefire to prevent Gazans from moving up in the Strip. We know that Israel is now going to be advancing its military campaign after the ceasefire down to the south of the Strip, where all of the Gazan citizens are. So what is going to happen with those residents, and what is going to happen with the Rafah border crossing? And we saw some interesting statements made in the press over the last week. First, by Knesset member and former UN ambassador Danny Danon and former deputy director of the Mossad Ram Ben Barak. They wrote in the Wall Street Journal that UN resolutions are doing nothing tangible to help Gaza's residents. It is imperative that the international community explore potential solutions to help civilians caught in the crisis. One idea is for countries around the world to accept limited numbers of Gazan families who have expressed a desire to relocate. And then in the Jerusalem Post, Minister of Intelligence Gila Gamliel writes, bringing the PA back to rule Gaza has failed in the past and will fail again. It is an option that is seen as illegitimate by the Israeli public. Another option is to promote the voluntary resettlement of Palestinians in Gaza for humanitarian reasons outside of the Strip. It is important that those who seek a life elsewhere be provided with that opportunity. Some world leaders are already discussing a worldwide refugee resettlement scheme and saying they would welcome Gazans to their countries. Until now, we've seen Egypt, Jordan, the rest of the Arab countries in the region, and the international community all saying that Gazans must not be allowed to leave the Strip. And yet we've seen in recent conflicts like the Syrian civil war that over 13 million Syrians were displaced and over 6 million of them were settled elsewhere, including in Turkey and in Europe. During the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, over 8 million Ukrainian residents were displaced and over 6 million of them resettled elsewhere outside of Ukraine, including in Israel that took over 30,000 Ukrainian refugees, many of them non-Jewish. So the question is, why will the international community not permit the Rafah border crossing to be open, not permit Gazan residents to flee the war zone, which should be considered a basic human right? The question is, Does the international community actually care about the lives of the Palestinian people, or are they just using the Palestinians as a political wedge against the state of Israel?
And Alex, you spoke about the international community. I want to take a moment as well in my Jerusalem Minute to address the international community, the United Nations, and the so-called international women's rights organizations. On November 25th, just this week, was the International Day of the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And yet, the United Nations and other women's rights groups have yet to condemn Hamas for the brutal October 7th massacre, which not only saw ISIS-level torture and murder, but also brutal and barbaric rape of Israeli women. And now, over 50 days since the October 7th massacre, all the United Nations Women's Rights Organization could muster was that it's alarmed by reports of rape. I mean, what happened to believing women? Apparently not when they're Israeli. Me too, unless you're a Jew. And so this disgusting silence only highlights the despicable double standards when it comes to the United Nations and the international community and the so-called women's rights organizations. And so I think that, today it is more important than ever that Israeli women, that the Israeli community speak out and send a clear message that we will not be silenced, and that if the UN and other international organizations refuse to speak out on behalf of Israeli women, then Israeli women and all of Israeli society will continue to speak out on their behalf. And that's my Jerusalem Minute.
Lidar, I think you're really onto something, and we see that this is a pattern inside the United Nations and the international community. The United Nations is a body that condemns Israel not more than any other country. They condemn Israel more than all other countries combined year after year after year. So I don't know that Israel is going to expect to get a fair shake in the United Nations anytime soon.
I think you're absolutely right. So Israel is, by all accounts today, fighting a multi-front war. It's not often discussed enough, but Hezbollah, the Iranian terror proxy group, is continuously firing missiles into Israel across its northern border with Lebanon. And now the Houthis from Yemen have fired missiles into Israel and are seizing Israeli ships in the Red Sea and the Indian Sea. I think we have a clip. Let's take a look. Okay, so Alex, what can you tell us about this new Houthi strategy of hijacking Israeli ships?
Well, from the very beginning of the war, Yemen, where the Houthis are located, declared war on the state of Israel. And we do see a common theme between Yemen, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. These are all Iranian proxies. And at the end of the day, while the international community wants to pretend that this is a conflict about Israel and the Palestinians, really this conflict is between Israel and the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And, this was a major step up in escalation, I think, and the U.S. has actually directly implicated Iran. We have a quote here, a direct quote from U.S. National Security Spokesman John Kirby, who said this past week that in light of the recent targeting of civilians by the Houthis and now the piracy of a ship in international waters, we have begun a review of potential terrorist designations and will be considering other options together with our allies and partners as well. Iran is complicit to its material support and its encouragement of the Houthi forces who conducted the seizure. Absolutely unacceptable. So this seems like the first time that the U.S. here is actually directly talking about Iran and it being complicit.
Well, I think that the United States from the very beginning knew that this conflict had the potential to escalate from the Gaza arena to southern Lebanon to beyond. And that's the reason why the United States in the beginning of the war brought its two USS carrier groups, the Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Gerald F. Ford, which has more air power on those planes than most countries have in their entire air forces, because they understood that this could get much bigger, much faster, and ultimately all eyes point back to Iran.
And has this worked? I mean, has this deterrence worked? Because we are seeing attacks on U.S. bases in Syria, in Iraq, by Iranian terror proxies. So has this deterrence, have these ships done their job?
Well, the way that the deterrence factor tends to work in the region is that the terror entities will each test the waters of what the other side is willing to accept. Certainly, that's not what happened on October 7th. That was a direct attack meant specifically to lure the IDF into the Gaza Strip. But the United States, from the very beginning after October 7th, said, don't test us. And now what's happening is exactly that. Hezbollah, the Houthis, are testing both Israel and the United States. And what they're doing is they're firing a little bit more day after day, watching Israel respond a little bit more day after day. And the problem with that strategy is that at some point it is very likely to boil into full-fledged conflict.
And, I want to focus for a minute specifically on the northern front, because really we've seen missiles coming in from Hezbollah fired into Israel almost on a daily basis. Just like Hamas fires missiles from the south, Hezbollah is firing missiles from the north. And I want to, get your 2 cents on first of all, what is maybe an update on what's happening in the north now, but also sort of a question about how can Israel be on a mission to eliminate Hamas, but then keep Hezbollah on its northern border. Hezbollah, which is by all accounts an even more dangerous enemy than Hamas. It's just inviting another October 7th massacre sometime down the line.
Well, we've already seen a lot of movement of militants along the border, threatening the border. This is Israel's northern border with southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah is deeply entrenched. And they fired over 1,000 mortars and more dangerously, anti-tank guided missiles at Israeli positions, both civilian and military positions. They've also sent numerous drones into Israeli airspace, coming down as far as Akko. And so certainly the escalations continue to grow, and there is a question of whether Israel can maintain the U.S. instructions not to widen the conflict. As you correctly mentioned, Hezbollah is a much more potent threat to the state of Israel than Hamas. Hezbollah has over 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at the state of Israel. And unlike the 30,000 Qassam rockets that Hamas has in Gaza, we're talking about long-range missiles. We're talking about precision-guided missiles. We're talking about missiles that can deliver much larger payloads than these Qassam rockets. And the threat is that if Hezbollah will start firing these weapons in rapid fire against the state of Israel, that there's no amount of Iron Dome, Arrow, David Sling missile defense systems that could shoot down those rockets as they were coming, and those missiles could do tremendous damage to the Israeli home front. So I think that you're correct. If Israel defeats Hamas but leaves Hezbollah in place, they haven't necessarily advanced their strategic position. Now, at the same time, Israel doesn't necessarily want to be fighting two fronts simultaneously, and I do think that there is within the IDF a conception that it's better to first deal with Hamas in the south, and once that threat is contained, then to move on to the north. But the question is Hezbollah going to play along that timetable? And will the international community support Israel if it does indeed take the battle front to the north?
And that's a very, very important question. And I think questions that a lot of Israelis have at the moment. I mean, because we have to remember as well that there are over 200,000 families who have been evacuated from not only the south of Israel, but from the north of Israel, because they can't stay in their homes in the north. And so at some point, Israel is going to have to address Hezbollah's threat.
You're right. Israel has already created a 5-kilometer border line or buffer zone, and it has evacuated many of its civilians that can see right across the border fence into Lebanon. And it's an unsustainable situation. And so there's definitely the threat that this war could expand to the north, but it could also expand to Yemen, where the Houthis have fired ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and sent drones to Israel in addition to hijacking the ships. And there's also the very real possibility that all of this hardware that the United States has sent over to the region could ultimately be used not only against these proxies like the Houthis and Hezbollah, but even against Iran itself.
Well, I think there's really only two solutions here. One is to reach some kind of ceasefire agreement, but we've seen what a ceasefire agreement is worth to a terrorist organization. And the other is to, as you mentioned, once we're done with Hamas, Israel will have to deal with the threat from both Hezbollah and the Houthis.
Well, the question is, how much patience does the international community have to allow Israel to move methodically, as it's been doing, first through Gaza, then through southern Lebanon, then potentially to Yemen, then on to Iran? How long will they allow the fighting to happen? And the question is, do they really want Israel to win in a strategic way that is conclusive and removes all the threats at its borders? It does seem right now that the international community is, along with the Israeli strategy of fighting against Hamas, it's clear the international community wants Israel to fight. Is it clear yet that the international community wants Israel to win?
And now our final topic, the news you don't hear, what's happening inside Israel. So Alex, missiles have been constantly fired on Israel. As we said, not only from the south, but also from the north. 200,000 people displaced in Israel. Nobody's talking about this. Why is nobody talking about this?
Well, first of all, I think it's because the pictures of the displaced Israelis don't look as dramatic as the pictures of the displaced Gazans. Or the evacuees from the north and the south, at this point, it's largely precautionary evacuations, creating the 5-kilometer buffer zone in the north and removing citizens from the threat of Gazan rockets on the envelope of the Gaza Strip communities, including the kibbutzim and cities like Sderot, all have been evacuated. But in addition to those evacuated that are living in hotels and hostels and guest houses right now, you have Israelis in major population centers like Ashkelon, Ashdod, Rehovot, Rishon LeZion, all the way up to Tel Aviv, ducking into bomb shelters throughout this conflict for 6 weeks. You've had over 10,000 rockets fired from the Gaza Strip. And yes, the Iron Dome system is shooting most of those out of the sky. But still, you cannot depend on a 100% interception rate. And that's led Israelis to be running in and out of bomb shelters nonstop. It's very, very traumatic. And it's something that gets underreported because those rockets don't do as much damage as what we're seeing in the Gaza Strip.
Absolutely. But I do want to take a moment as well to talk about something else that's, that we're seeing here in Israel that really isn't making it out of Israel. And that, we can try to maybe end the show on a positive note. And that, of course, is sort of Israeli society and how it's come together for this war effort. Ahead of, before the war, there was a lot of division within Israel. We saw protests out on the street against the legal reform. Right now, it seems like a lifetime ago. But what we've seen since October 7th and since the onset of this war is really Israeli civilians coming together, coming out in support and whether it's organizing food drives or, organizing warm clothes for those who have displaced. I mean, we've really seen civilians, the army, the government, everybody sort of coming together and uniting as one. So I think that's something that also needs to be said, that Israel should be very, very proud of. And I'd like to also hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you're correct to mention the political divisiveness that came in the weeks and months and even years before the war. Israel had 5 elections in just over a 4-year period. And things have been very divisive politically in Israel for a while. And I believe that that's actually one of the calculations that led Hamas and its backer Iran to think that now was a time for a strike. They saw the Israeli community as divided, and when Israelis are divided, they are weak. But it took an October 7th event. Unfortunately, that's what it took. But it took that event in order to bring the society together. And not only have Israelis been stepping up to volunteer and to help out and to give more blood donations than we've ever seen before in history, but also to put the political divisions to the side. And the morale in Israel is surprisingly strong. I think that's one of the main stories that's not been communicated. Israelis recognize now's the time to come together. They have come together. Their morale is high, and also the morale of the troops is extraordinarily high. There's a lot of conceptions that were broken that led to this moment on October 7th, and yet this moment, October 7th, has the opportunity to correct a lot of the misconceptions, and in the weeks ahead, we'll start to unravel what those misconceptions were and how October 7th can put Israel in a better place strategically moving forward.
Absolutely, and I think that's a good place to end our show today. Thank you, Alex. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in. That's been a Jerusalem Minute. Tune in next time as we address the week's major issues coming out of Israel.